that Habermas offers. So that if there is progress in Kasira, it's through what Hannah Arendt, or something very close to it, would call an enlarged mentality. It is not the progress towards a kind of modernity and an ethics of suspicion that is absolutely central to the notion of the performative power of language as action in modernity that Habermas defends. There would be simply no place in Habermas for the kind of African humanism and spiritual practices that are often at its heart. They would just be outdated, magical modes of misguided thinking, which he, as he once said, he believes that, Africans will learn. It's just taking them a while. Many African philosophers would say back to him that hopefully Habermas himself will learn to learn and realize that his notion of ontogenetic modernity is completely misguided and rooted in imperialism. Too often, African humanism is either condemned as outdated, dangerous traditionalism, as in Habermas, or being so integrally tied to Eurocentric ideas that there's no residue of a living intellectual heritage. As we will see in our engagement with Akil Mbembe, African modes of self-writing is not a facile task whereby one can simply report the supposed objective character of an indigenous population. For modes of African self-writing are indeed haunted by discourses of colonization that segment the African subject in frozen narratives of fantasy, victimization, and alterity outside of their own autonomy. But we will take up a certain version of African humanism in the idea of Ubuntu, which is a Xhosa Zulu word, respectful of its importance and its articulation of a universalizable active ethic of virtue, indeed a practice or a performance of what it means to be an ethical human being. In her essay on peace utopias, Rosa Luxemburg steadfastly argues that the world stands threatened by the militarist enclave both in times of war and peace. For Luxemburg, bourgeois apostles, and this is a quote from her, of peace are relying on the influence of fine words in their illusionary activities towards peace, which invent all sorts of practical projects, this is again Luxemburg, for gradually restraining militarism, and consider every outward apparent sign of a tendency towards peace as a genuine article. To take every expression of the ruling democracy in this vein, as it were, is to exaggerate it into a basis for earnest activity. The problem with humanism related to the way Luxemburg critiques bourgeois peace work is we've lost sight of the way in which humanism must function as an activity of our being in the world, both alongside of and ahead of any conception of the human. Moreover, Luxemburg is clear in her decisive writings on the accumulation of capital that peasantization and modernization necessitate an ethical shattering of the black African world. And indeed, she was one of the first writers to actually bring analysis of the exploitation, the super-exploitation in South Africa, long, of course, before the founding of apartheid. Rending it as a mere prey to the larger machinery of capital accumulation that would extract both the natural resources and living labor of people for the growth of the capitalist enclave. And indeed, in South Africa, because the Zulus and Xhosas were such successful peasants, the British passed two laws. The first, the Grey Act, which imposed a hut tax, a very high hut tax on all independent peasants, and if they couldn't pay the tax, they had to join the workforce immediately. That didn't work because the Xhosa and Zulu peasants were too successful. They could pay the hut tax. So in 1913, the British, in a three-sentence law, took 89.3% of all the land of South Africa for themselves in order to create a proletariat for the gold and diamond mines that were discovered in 1886. 3 sentences. All the land is taken away from you and given over to us because there was simply no way to defeat the Zulus. Even after a 13-year war, the Zulus continued to fight back. We follow Rosa Luxemburg here in that capitalist accumulation is inseparable from imperialism, and this is her difference from Lenin, capitalism is itself always imperialistic. It's not the highest stage of capitalism that it's imperialistic, meaning there's never really an overtonement of primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is obviously what went on in South Africa when you created a migrant labor force, put them in hostels, took them away from their families, and justified paying them less than even the value of their labor power, because they supposedly still, in about 8% of the land that remained, were allowed to own 8 acres. Have you ever tried to farm 8 acres? And said that that's where their food came from, even though, of course, these native reserves were hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where they were working. We follow Rosa Luxemburg here in that capitalist accumulation is inseparable from imperialism and the maintenance of enclaves of unfree labor, even in the capitalist sense of the word, and the perpetuation of otherness in the form of reducing migrant workers to second-class citizens, or in the case of the 1 million residents of London who are not even citizens at all, to human beings who have fallen below the status of a human. We cannot repeat Luxemburg's complex argument here, but we do want to note the relevance of her insistence that a closed capitalist society can simply not overcome the core crisis of capitalist accumulation, which inheres in overproduction and or underconsumption. Of course, these two problems are connected to the drive of capital to ever increase its profit margins, which in turn depends on the expansion of itself through the creation not only of new markets, but the fabrication of cheap labor forces that are denied any of the basic rights we have come to associate with free labor, such as the right to organize. Simply put, capitalism creates an outside to itself that it both needs and destroys at the same time. And this connects capitalism integrally to political violence and outright oppressions of peoples, nation-states, and movements that challenge its hegemony. Before turning to a more careful articulation of Ubuntu as within the realm of any new humanism, it's essential to review the challenge to modes of African self-writing. Mbembe offers a searing critique of Afro-radicalism and the metaphysics of difference inherent in what he calls nativism. To quote Mbembe, the effort to determine the conditions under which the African subject could attain full selfhood, become self-conscious, and be answerable to no one else, soon encountered historicist thinking in two forms that led it into a dead end. The first of these is what might be termed Afro-radicalism, with its baggage of instrumentalism and opportunism. The second is the burden of metaphysics of difference, i.e. nativism. The first current of thought, which liked to present itself as democratic, radical, and progressive, used Marxist and nationalist categories to develop an imaginaire of culture and politics in which a manipulation of the rhetoric of autonomy, resistance, and emancipation serves as the sole criteria for determining the legitimacy of an authentic African discourse. The second current of thought developed out of an emphasis on the native condition. It promoted the idea of a unique African identity founded on membership in the black race, close quote. Mbembe's powerful critique argues that African philosophy has nothing comparable to either German philosophy or Jewish messianism in terms of their aspiration to articulate a universalizable narrative of our being human and an ethics that seeks to justify itself as an embodiment of an ethically new way of being together in the world, something close to what Nancy calls communism. For Mbembe, African philosophy, and he would include the intellectual heritage of African humanism, is haunted by four main challenges. First, modes of African self-writing lack self-reflexivity and as such embrace positive notions of knowledge that have been deployed to silence alternative views of truth other than the one held out by dominant revolutionary parties. Second, there is a reified vision of history in which Africa and its narrative, and certainly the story of African individuals, is rendered as long as a series of subjugations and victimizations. The only solution to such a reified history, according to Mbembe, is the uncritical history of a struggle against such victimage and